Velkommen tilbage til Kina-nørderne. I'm going to switch to English now because this is another one of our specials, and today we have a very special guest. We're so happy to have with us from Washington, D.C., Emily Feng, the international correspondent of NPR, National Public Radio. Welcome to the podcast, Emily.
Thanks, Casper. Thanks, Mads. That's a very grand introduction, but thank you.
And we love when we have esteemed guests on the show, so it's not just me and Mads talking about, or rambling about China, I should rather say. Emily, you were based in Beijing as correspondent for NPR, and have seen a lot of things in Asia and China, and also lived in Taiwan, in Taipei. How did your interest in China get started?
I actually wanted to start reporting in Myanmar. That's how my interest in Asia got started. I was a sophomore in college, I believe, when there was a democratic spring in Burma. There were elections for the first time. Aung San Suu Kyi was elected. The military junta had stepped back. And I thought it struck me as a country that was like China in the 1980s, as in just opening up to the rest of the world and undergoing major social and political reforms. And I'd gotten kind of interested in China journalism. I just didn't think I wanted to do that. But I thought all these great correspondents got their start in the 1980s and the early 1990s in China. Myanmar seems like this totally open place where you can go and make your mark. And so what I did was I skipped a few weeks of my last semester in college, and I backpacked around Myanmar, and I very quickly realized that this was not the place to be a freelancer or beginner journalist. It was kind of dangerous still. There was no infrastructure. It was wildly expensive because the State Department, the American State Department, I think had just like moved in and expanded all of its consulates and embassies. And they were starting to fire people for reporting about the Rohingya crisis. So as a freelancer, I would have no editorial protection whatsoever. And then I thought, well, I'm interested in Asia. Where else can I go? And I resisted this for so long, but I thought to myself, I speak Chinese. I can go to China. It's a big country. There should be stories there. So I begrudgingly moved to China and ended up loving it.
I think that that's what gets a lot of people hooked, that they go to China, have these old conception, the notion about China, and then when they're fully embedded into what China is, this huge contradicting mass of people and culture and modernity and all this, it's fascinating. What would you say was the biggest shock of moving to China, both as a reporter, but also just as a person coming from the US?
So I write about this in the book. I'm Chinese American, so I had some passing familiarity with China because both my parents are from the same small area in southern China in Zhejiang province, and I'd gone 3 or 4 times as a child to visit relatives. My entire family on both sides still lives in this one province. And I knew that part of the country, but I lived in Beijing. So this is in the far north. This was like another world compared to the world that my parents had grown up in southern China. And so just wrapping my mind around how big China is, how diverse it is in terms of people and language and culture and geography and what people care about was difficult. I really fell out of my depth. And it was also why I wanted to travel so much when I started covering China at first. And I write about this in my book. Like it was that understanding that this wasn't just the country of my parents. It was so much more. It had moved on since then, of course, but also my parents had grown up in this tiny corner of China, and there was a lot of the rest of the country to see. And that ambition to see the rest of the country and try to understand it, I think drove all 3 of us to get really fascinated in the country.
So, Emily, today we're also going to talk about your book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, which centers on several of the stories and about people in China that you wrote while you were living there. Before we jump into that, I would also like to ask, we probably have listeners who maybe are interested in writing about China, or maybe we even have aspiring journalists listening to our podcast here. So could you tell us a little bit and tell them a little bit about your background for, jumping into the field of journalism, and maybe give a few advice to someone who would be interested in pursuing a similar career or maybe direction as you have taken?
You can't see me because this is audio, but I'm grimacing. I hate giving advice because journalism is so bespoke and there's so many different types of journalism. I shouldn't say I hate giving advice, but it's hard to give something that's a one-size-fits-all recommendation. I've always loved writing. I've always loved reading. That has always been my refuge since I was a young child. So I knew that I wanted to do something in the creation of stories, fictional or nonfiction. But my first interest was in fiction. I wanted to be a fiction writer. I wanted to be a novelist. And it turns out that it's really, really hard to write stories that you make up. And then I took a magazine journalism course in college and studied a lot of what we call literary journalism, which unfortunately, by the time I was in college, was kind of dead. The golden age of literary journalism was like in the early 90s, Gay Talese and all those folks. And that's not financially sustainable anymore. But I realized in reading magazine journalism that you could write about real people and real events in ways that felt like they were a fictional short story. And I wanted to create that experience, whether in text or in audio, for people. I just had to find the stories that merited that kind of treatment. China has those in spades, whether it's people who are just absurdly tragic or funny or colorful or dramatic. They have the kinds of stories that are colorful in scale that are hard to find anywhere else. I started out in newspaper journalism. So met some people through university who knew some other people. This is the thing in journalism. I hate to say this, but network. It's a small world. And so people will be able to recommend you to other people. And journalism is one of those, it's so open-ended that you cannot just read a resume and see, oh, this person did this and went to a nice university and therefore they're going to be really good at journalism. No, journalism throws you in weird situations and you don't really know how a person is going to react until they've actually done it. And so this is why word of mouth recommendations matter so much, I think, especially in the world of journalism, because you need someone to say, I've seen Emily go through something very difficult and she did this. And that matters so much more than a resume. It's also why clips matter. So anyways, network, write as much as possible so you have those clips. And it was through those kind of word of mouth recommendations that I got an internship in China and then met someone at a dinner party, which is kind of how I got hired at the Financial Times. And then from there, I'd always been interested in audio. This was when podcasting became a thing. From there, started, as you guys are doing, but I did it much less professionally, started writing my own audio newsletter, which I'd send out to friends as a way to keep in touch with them when I was first living in China. And then this job at NPR opened up and didn't think I qualified whatsoever. It was minimum 5 to 10 years audio experience, and I had precisely 0. But both of the previous China correspondents for NPR, God bless them, reached out and said, have you considered this? You may not feel like you're qualified, but you can certainly grow into this role. So I have to thank those two men for really supporting me and applying. And then I just listened to everything that I could to get better at audio writing, which unsurprisingly is extremely different from writing for a newspaper or a magazine. And now I really, really enjoy doing both. I feel lucky that I have the ability to craft audio soundscapes and also write books, which was my first love.
Before we delve into your book, Emily, can I just ask which story that you covered while you were in China are you the most proud of? Or stories. It doesn't have to be just one if it's hard to pick.
I'm pretty hard on myself. I feel like I could have done every story better. There are some stories that I think only worked for audio that I'm happy I was working in audio that I could do because I don't think they would have lifted off the page. So, for example, I did a story at the very, very beginning of COVID, the beginning of the COVID pandemic in the rest of the world. And it was about a family who had been stuck in their own home in the Xinjiang region. And it was because they were essentially under house arrest. And I think that as a text story, it would have been kind of dry, but because it was all audio and I could take the listener there and try to visit the family. And there was a lot of drama and hijinks that ensued trying to talk to them. And they ended up getting locked back in their home while I was there. It was just a much more dramatic story because you could listen to it. During the COVID pandemic, this was the first experience I had with doing stories remotely, especially in the first couple of weeks. Just cold calling people in Wuhan and kind of assembling these quilts of all these different voices and finding themes and experiences that people were having. Difficulty finding beds, relatives suddenly dying. After a few days of being sick at home, it was terrible. It was really terrible. What's a fun story that I really like doing? There were a lot. The great thing about NPR is, I think what really makes an NPR story shine is if there is a sense of wonder. Sure, we want to do breaking news. We're a nonprofit, so we're here to educate the public as well. But mostly, my personal philosophy is if the story has sparkle, if it instills a sense of wonder and curiosity in someone, because it's a bad or a happy story, then I've succeeded. So a whimsical story that I did that I really, really loved was I did a 3-piece series just on the sounds of old Beijing. So I think I did one about the old city walls and the different sounds of the different gates as you went through what's now the Line 2 subway station that's built below the remains of the old city walls. I did one on pigeon whistles. These are these little reed instruments that you attach to the flocks of pigeons that old Chinese men like to raise. Some stereotypes are true. A Chinese man reaches a certain age and all of a sudden there's an irrepressible urge to raise pigeons. I've seen it happen to my own father. But these pigeon whistles
I've seen it with
so
my
lovely.
own eyes. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure. Every man wants to raise pigeons in a stairwell. Every man once they reach a certain age. And what was the third piece I did? I can't remember now. It's been a few years. But that was really, really fun. Oh, it was a sound museum that had opened up. Or no, maybe it was the pigeon whistle story. Anyways, those were stories that had no news value whatsoever, but they were incredibly fun to report.
I love that you say it's the stories that sparkle, that instill wonder, that really has a certain quality. And just from the stories that you mention here, all of the stories you just mentioned, what inspired you in the process of reporting these stories to then compile or maybe save some of the stories for a full book?
The book, and I write about this in the beginning of the book, the idea for the book began because I started to have an inkling that it might not be possible to stay in China long term. I had a bit of a feeling that my time in China was limited. So I was trying to think of some way, I'm a person who plans. I was trying to think of some way to continue reporting on the country, having some kind of journalistic tie to the country, even if I no longer lived there, which did eventually happen in 2022 when I moved to Taiwan, which was lovely, but it was not at first a voluntary move to leave China. So that's how the genesis of the book began. And then I kind of let it go. I didn't work on it until about 3 years later. But as I looked back on when I asked myself what stories that I wish I had told, or stories that I felt like I had to leave on the cutting room floor because they didn't have room in a 5-minute radio story, they always came back to this theme of identity, about how people think of themselves, how they're seen by other people. Of course, the natural diversity that we talked about that you find in China that I had presented in different facets and stories, but not collectively, so you could see it all in one place. And that's what I wanted to capture in the book, that China is such a big place that there is incredible multitude and variety in what people think and how people behave. And they're not all homogenous, Mandarin-speaking, party-loving people. Those people certainly exist and their viewpoints are valid. But people, shockingly, in China have different identities and they care about those.
So maybe we can get more into your book. And the title of your book is, of course, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, a play on Let 100 Flowers Bloom, the campaign by old Chairman Mao. You talked a little bit briefly about what sparked you to write this book, but could you introduce to our listeners the project, the book, and who you're writing it for and what's it more about?
My ambition, I hope I succeeded, is to emulate the literary journalist writers that I mentioned that I read in college. So the book is a series of interlocking profiles of real people, often not the main characters of stories that I did publish for NPR, but people who I met on the fringes of those stories who, I think about a third of them ended up making their way into NPR stories, and the rest were people I met in the process of reporting, but their voices didn't get into the news stories at the time. But I kept in touch with many of these people because I think they embody different facets of Chinese identity. And I defined identity very broadly. So the first third of the book takes place in the urban heart of China along the East Coast. And I chose characters from those places who represented different political visions and economic visions for how the country should develop. The middle of the book then moves farther out to what are the historic frontiers of the Qing Empire, and whose borders then the modern day PRC inherited. And those characters in the middle of the book, I think, really emphasize cultural, ethnic, linguistic identities that exist in China. And of course, how that comes increasingly in tension with, into tension with state policy. And then the last third of the book, I finished reporting when I had left mainland China. So in some ways, it was fortuitous that I finished the book after having moved to Taiwan, because the last third of the book is about characters in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and then finally in the Chinese diaspora in the US. So it doesn't even take place within mainland China. But that was intentional from the beginning, because I wanted to make the point that the story of China is global. You can find it in Denmark, you can find it in Canada, you can find it in Africa. And this conversation about identity, what is Chinese, what should China be, has always happened. Some of the most consequential decisions on those topics have always happened in the diaspora outside of China.
So are there any characters or stories that you would have loved to include in the book that just wasn't a space for? I'm sure you had an editor. Did you have any arguments with the editor about what to include in the book, or did you have like completely free reins wanting to do what you wanted to do?
No arguments, basically a complete free rein. The limit was time, and the limit was, can you get access to these people? So one theme that I feel I undercovered in the book were rural versus urban identities. And the big reason behind why I couldn't find someone who I felt represented that holistically was because the villages were so hard to get to during COVID. It was hard enough getting city to city, but at least most cities had a standard protocol. If you got tested, then you were fine and you had the code. But villages, as you remember, particularly the first year, were really, really, really conservative. And so even if you met all their rules, they still wouldn't let you in. So I never found a good rural character. There are certainly people who are rural in the book, but the identities that I chose to bring out, for example, there's a book about gender identity in the book and the role of women and how that changes through society. And the main character is, first of all, absent. I never got to interview her. She's a woman who is found chained by her neck in a cowshed, and a video of her goes viral, and it sparks this discussion about the one-child policy, about human trafficking, about reproductive rights. But no one has ever really interviewed her. We still don't even know who she really is. And certainly she represents the plight of rural China as well. But I chose to talk more about the fact that she was a woman rather than the fact that she lived in the countryside. When I was writing that book, speaking of literary journalism, there's a really, really famous profile of Frank Sinatra called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. I don't know if you've heard of this.
No, I haven't. No.
It's a very, very famous profile, probably a little bit too long, of this American singer. And he backs out of the interview like the hour before the journalist is sent there specifically to cover him because he has a bad cold. And so this writer is like, I promised a 20-page magazine spread. How am I going to deliver? And he writes this beautiful profile interviewing all the people around Frank Sinatra.
Wow, so he doesn't actually talk to Sinatra himself.
Exactly. So that was my inspiration for the Chained Woman chapter.
Wow.
I think, Emily, it is so great that in the book you center on ordinary people in China, because it's really rare in the day-to-day stories, at least that we get in Denmark, that we get those stories out from all types of different parts of China and also from different layers of society. And I would say that any of the big books that are coming out these years about China, usually on a macro level, I would encourage readers simply to read your book as a companion to those, because it really shows what China also is, down to earth in lived lives and lived experiences. And with that, I also want to ask you, you include in the book figures such as Zhou Li, who is mentioned in the book as the Asian Che Guevara, is like a nickname that he got. And he became an unlikely icon in China's online culture. And I would like to ask what drew you to his story, And what does his popularity tell us about how young people in China, they express frustration and humor and rebellion in general, but also online?
I have to thank my producer at the time, Owen Cao, for introducing me to Jolie. She was like, hey, by the way, this guy has opened a restaurant. I don't know if we want to go and interview him. And I was like, who? She goes, oh, here's the meme that's based off of him. And the meme is him handcuffed to what looks like a prison wall with like a bright fluorescent bulb over him saying, I will never work. I'm incapable of work. And this went viral during the COVID pandemic when everyone across the world, including in China, was feeling burned out. I loved his story because there were global parallels. And thank you for pointing out that I focused on ordinary people. I also tried to focus on people who are not dissidents. Yes, everyone in this book at some point comes into tension or open conflict with the state in China or the party, but all of them in some way see themselves as patriots who believe in the project of China, at some point want to make China better, and maybe in that process differ on the means and the ends with the Chinese state. But Zhou Liqi is one of these. He's an unlikely hero to people. He's a reprobate. I mean, he becomes famous because he's stealing scooters, is really bad at stealing scooters, gets imprisoned all the time, and goes to prison 6 times, I believe. And it's one of these jailhouse interviews that then later goes viral during the pandemic. So when he comes out of prison, all of a sudden he's this folk hero. And then my producer shows me this news item that says he's opened up a barbecue restaurant in southern China. We can go and actually meet him. And so I ended up doing a story about why he had gone viral, why he tapped into this feeling of general lethargy and pessimism about the Chinese economy. I think that continues to this day among millennial and Gen Z people in China that many other journalists have written about since. But for the book, I wanted to delve more into him, how it felt to be in his shoes and come out of prison with no internet access and suddenly become an internet star on platforms that didn't exist when he went into prison, to also talk about how quickly the Chinese internet has developed. And one of the things that had surprised me when moving to China, and I know that you know this because you're on social media sites and on TikTok and Little Red Book and all this, is we hear about censorship in China and it's very real and very sophisticated, but that doesn't mean the internet is this dead place. People are incredibly creative and they're making things and still having a lot of fun online. But of course, if the proverbial crap does hit the fan, then of course they can take things down and shape things. But absent that, there's an incredible landscape of conversation and internet culture happening online. And Zhou Liqi was part of that. So I wanted to explore that in the book. And I feel one of my goals with trying to get people to sympathize with characters, no matter if they're the villain or the hero in the chapter, is I feel like we have all this great material about people from, and rightfully so, people from other countries in our media, like people from Ukraine or people from Russia or people from Palestine or people from Israel. And you get incredible access to these people, and people make documentaries. And I watched an amazing documentary the other day, filmed in a war zone called 2,000 Meters to Andriivka, and it follows these Ukrainian soldiers in the 2023 counteroffensive. Incredible first-person view footage, and you come out of that film feeling incredible sympathy for the plight of these Ukrainian soldiers, but also these Russian soldiers that they're killing at close range in the film. We don't have that same level of access to characters in China. And I think part of that is because of China's own restrictions on reporting on the ground. It's very hard to get close to a person like that and to have access to a person. Also, people are really bad at talking about themselves these days. You ask them, how did you feel when this happened? They'll give you a monosyllabic answer. But I really tried to focus on people whose stories spoke for themselves, who I'd gotten to know well, where there was a wealth of information about their character development. And so that as a reader, maybe just for a moment, you felt like this is a real person who has feelings and had a childhood, even if they live on the other side of the world and speak a language I don't understand.
Emily, of course you say that they're not actual dissidents that you're centering on in the book, but a lot of the narratives are something that the party and Xi Jinping are not very happy about coming up. Any narratives that counters the party narrative. Did you face any backlash from the party or anyone? I mean, because we've seen examples of especially journalists of Chinese descent and American Chinese journalists, Australian Chinese journalists being harassed online by, I don't know if you want to call them agents of the party or how we should define them. Have you faced any backlash during writing the book and since publishing it?
During writing the book and publishing it, no. But certainly in reporting the book, I had a kind of rough time in China. But it's happened so long ago, and honestly, it made me I kind of enjoyed it. Not to say, so you guys, you both know this. It's hard to get people to speak. Half your interviews get canceled last minute. You get these weird phone calls from the regional propaganda department asking if they want to help you arrange interviews instead. And when you say no, then everyone else cancels. You're followed around. Your sources are detained. You interview someone and they're very, very happy to do so. But then after the story is published, they are very upset because obviously someone is putting pressure on them from behind the scenes and they ask for the story to, there's a whole range of things that you encounter on a weekly basis in China. It can be really hard to get something very simple done journalistically. But I liked that challenge. I liked the grit that it brought out of people, both the people that I interviewed and also in myself. It brought out the best, I think, in the people around me. And it brought certainly the correspondents who covered China together. I think that the press corps in China is remarkable because of how non-competitive we were and are. Because everyone understands this is a big story. They're there because they care about the story, not just because they were assigned there and it's a 3-year gig maybe. And also it's difficult, so we all pool resources and knowledge to cover the story. I think it's still like that now. And so, yes, there were nasty things written about me online, nasty things that were emailed to me or posted on my social media, Chinese and English, really, hit pieces in Beijing state media every few months. But it also lights a fire underneath you because you're like someone's reading this, obviously. So I'm going to keep going. But nothing after the book was written.
How, if you can talk to us a little bit about losing access to China and covering China from outside of China. Right now, as you know, there's only one Danish correspondent in mainland China, in Shanghai, Philip, who we both know. I mean, of course, you can cover China, the big stories. I mean, a lot of the Danish Asia correspondents are based in Taipei, and you probably know them as well. What are the cons of not having access, boots on the ground in mainland China when covering China and Asia?
I would say 2/3 of the stories that I did were stories that I'd stumbled across because I was living there and I heard someone talking about something that then piqued my interest, that then led me to the final story. And then about half the people in my stories are people that I just randomly meet because you're somewhere and you run into them, or someone gives you a suggestion to go to another place and then you find that person. So there is a level of spontaneity that creates better stories and more representative, more insightful stories that I don't have because everything has to be planned ahead of time. These are people that I've arranged to interview ahead of time. There are these arcane rules in China that Chinese citizens cannot do original reporting for foreign outlets. So I cannot deputize a producer to go and do the reporting or even do the recording for me. I've got to be the person online asking the questions and responding in interviews. So we do our best. I think we still get great sound and great interviews and portraits, snapshots of life in China, but it lacks the spontaneity that makes something feel alive, creates that sparkle and wonder that was so easy to do when you were just stumbling your way through story after story in China. You asked, I had to laugh when you asked my title at the beginning before we started recording, which is, was your title still international correspondent? And it's a totally fair question because it's an oxymoron. I'm a foreign correspondent who was living in Washington, D.C., covering China from America. It doesn't totally make sense, but we try to make it work.
Also, you talked about it earlier, speaking of boots on the ground, and when you're interviewing people, and again, as you said, it's incredibly hard to even get people to talk to you. Basically, I can say as a white foreign correspondent, there's usually not a big upside in talking to a foreign correspondent, especially not one from a little market from Denmark, because I mean, no one's going to hear your story. No one's really going to accept this little audience. How do you protect your sources also? Because under the rule of Xi Jinping, he's clamping down more and more on people talking to Western media in particular. How do you still get the story and get the information from people you interview while still, or trying to keep them safe and protect them from the party and the state?
I think there's a lot of gray areas. So there's a lot of topics and also just a lot of opinionated people who still miraculously want to share their opinion or their experiences. People like to chat. So it can be hard getting them on tape or on camera, but people still want to gab. That's not to say it isn't hard. You know, I was trying to find someone to interview over the weekend, for example, and my producer went out and was trying to meet people, and we found someone who we thought was really, really good, but they backed out last minute. So it can be a numbers game as well, where you're just trying 5 or 6 people, and maybe out of those you get 1 or 2 who become part of the story, who want to speak. Whereas in Europe or in America, basically anyone you call will pick up the phone and say, yeah, come on by. But there's still, this is why it's so worth it for outlets. I hope your editor is listening, Casper. It's so worth it for outlets
former
editor, to have people on the ground, because people still want to speak, but sometimes you have to be there. You have to show them that you want to listen to them, and you're investing resources in them to get their story for them to want to speak. So just because, yes, it's completely true, China doesn't want independent reporting. It tries to control foreign journalists and domestic journalists, but there's still a lot of wiggle room in between.
Also, due to the changes we've seen in the world, in the international order just this year after Donald Trump came back as president, I think Mass and I have been talking to people about that it's probably never been more important to get China right now. What do we miss by not having boots on the ground in China? It goes for a lot of Danish media again. No one correspondent in all of China. A lot of Danish businesses. I mean, there are subsidies in China run by Chinese only. They maybe go to China once every year. What do we risk by not having a regular presence in China, or by getting China wrong?
It's very easy when you're not in China to get swept up in what everyone else is talking about and thinking about on China. I'm sure you've experienced this now that you're back in Europe. It's definitely true in Washington, D.C. There's so much China experience in D.C., but even that doesn't mean that people get swept up in the hot topic or the trendy analysis of something that's happening in China for the month. I also think when you're not in China, if there is bias in journalism, I always defend journalism as it still very much is the pursuit of the truth, and mainstream outlets still do their best to cover the news in depth and objectively. But if there is bias in journalism, it comes in what stories you choose to cover, because we have limited time and limited reporters. And if I'm sitting here in the US and I'm thinking about, all right, this month, ambitiously, I might have time to do 3 or 4 feature stories. What are those going to be? And I'm looking through the information that's come to me and what people are talking about. And if 90% of that is about military competition and trade and China's economy, then as I start looking for stories and characters, it's probably going to veer towards those topics. Whereas if I were in China, the information and the inputs that I'd be experiencing would be way more varied. And I probably would have stories that maybe are a little bit more kooky, more personal, more about culture and society, more about what Chinese people are thinking about day to day, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with American interests. And I think the stories would be more varied. But I don't know what I am missing out on if I'm not there. And I think it's important. I think there's actual business and political value to doing stories that don't necessarily support our foreign policy or economic interests at the time, because you just need to know what people are thinking about in a huge country where, yes, there are big markets, and yes, they're a military superpower, and yes, are experiencing more frictions with the rest of the world.
You talked earlier about the online presence of many, especially younger Chinese, and in your book you center, of course, on identity and belonging of people in China. And I wanted to ask, because I think it's also something that I get asked about quite often, both by media and by ordinary Danes when I'm out giving presentations. So, how are Chinese millennials and Gen Alpha redefining what it is to be Chinese? So, what are some of the traits that we could say the young Chinese have, especially compared to, if we compare to earlier generations, like the ones that were shaped by Mao and the years of the economic reforms? I know it's a big question, but I think there is a lot of focus on like some of the traits that we see within some of the younger cohorts.
I think they're very sophisticated. They're very online, so they can see how other countries talk about things, make things. I think they're aesthetically very discerning. I do think the general observation that they're more apolitical is very, very true. I think because many people did not live through the Mao era, they also have maybe no understanding of the party state and what it's capable of. I think that they have much higher expectations than their parents, because most of them were born during a time of great prosperity and movement upwards. I think that they are not so different from teenagers in North America or Europe, because there's a convergence towards the kinds of things, even if they're not watching the exact same television shows, there is a convergence in the style and the storytelling formats and the aesthetics of much of the social media and pop culture that people are listening to or watching these days. So in some ways, I think that there's more similarities between young people around the world, between the US and China, vice versa. But I have to say, I am realizing that I'm getting a little bit older. I definitely don't have as many friends who are in their early 20s, or definitely not teenagers. And this is an area where I really feel like you need to be in China to know. Even lurking on TikTok and Douyin all the time, or Xiaohongshu, is not going to get you as good of an insight into what young people think and what they want.
We also hear so much about the pressures of young people in China and all these different phrases that there are, like Tangping and Bailan. And Casper and I have certainly discussed this a lot on our podcast. And like, to that, what are some of the pressures that young people in China they face when they balance personal identity with some of the state's expectations, as Casper also mentioned earlier, like nationalism and loyalty, conformity, and such?
I think people would be surprised that young people in China, yes, they're apolitical, but it doesn't mean that they have strong identities and aspirations of being the person they feel like they are. I think that there is a general sense, an awareness, intuitively, that the state is a powerful state and that you must conform to unspoken rules in China, even if people don't conceptualize that in political terms. So I think that private space matters so much. I think that people, especially starting during the COVID pandemic, have created their own little worlds. I think within family and friend circles, people are still very, very open and often retreat into those because economic times are tough and because politically things are much more strict than they were 10, 12 years ago. I'm losing my train of thought, but in general, just watching television shows and seeing what people are browsing and what they're even buying, I think that there is kind of a sense of a lack of momentum in where people feel like the country is going. And it leads to this very, very strange split in how we talk about China, because if you do focus on certain industries, China's killing it. It's innovating, it's creating world-class private companies that can compete in electric vehicles and semiconductor manufacturing, in consumer tech. But a lot of those aren't making a lot of money just yet. And as an average young person, you're not making a whole lot. And if you're in the other companies, the other industries that used to be part of the old economy, then you're facing potential layoffs and salary cuts. And yeah, that ennui is palpable when I speak to people. But conversely, I think there is so much more of a focus on hobbies and on home life and on leisure that's been interesting to observe, that I think is the flip side of that coin, which is not a bad thing. I'm glad that people can enjoy their lives. We don't have to speak about Chinese people as like economic units and the productivity they crank out.
I want to ask you, Emily, because you wrote in the introduction of your book something that that really struck me. You write, "Now, looking back at that conversation, I'm more sympathetic. I too wanted to be considered Chinese and missed China, though I no longer lived there. But I realized, like many of the characters in this book, we were all yearning for different Chinas, and we were all chasing after visions of a China that no longer existed or perhaps never had." I think that really struck me because I think Mass and I and everyone who's lived in China throughout a period of time, especially China watchers, Sinologists, at least Mass and I have talked to people like, oh, it was so much better back in the 80s, and before the Olympics it was much better, or just after the Olympics before Xi Jinping it was so much better.
Oh yeah.
And I think Evan Osnos wrote an article for the New Yorker called I think China's Age of Malay, I think it was called, where I feel like he also longed for a China that was no longer there and maybe never was. And I think also Denmark's strategy towards China, and Europe's and maybe the US as well, were hoping that, especially under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, that China was going to be a democracy or becoming more like a democracy. Maybe a huge misreading of China. Again, getting China right, do we have the sense of longing for a China that never was instead of looking at the China there is? Or how do you see this concept of the China that we long for that perhaps is not even there?
Because China is so big, and because I think it's figured so large in people's cultural imaginations. Think about the French obsession with chinois starting in the 1800s, or the Dutch with Chinese ceramics, that we constructed in the absence of true knowledge and access a China that we thought existed, and then when it opened up, discovered and have been discovering that it's so different. And then for me, there was a personal level, of course, which was I'd heard about China secondhand through the stories of my parents, but they'd also only seen a certain kind of China at a certain time. And so when I went to China on my own, the story had changed, and I loved that. And then when I moved to Taiwan, I think the anecdote that you mentioned is specifically an anecdote that one of the former presidents of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, told me. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my God, President Ma, you are delusional. I say as much in the book. And but I have sympathy with him because he'd grown up as well with these stories of China that his parents had fled. And up until a few years ago, he'd never seen that China. And I had more empathy for someone who had grown up with this big shadow of what China was supposed to mean and what it was supposed to do for his life and what it actually had become. This figures in foreign policy discussions about the US. We thought China would open up and develop politically this way because we were engaged economically with that. And again, that's one's outside perspective coloring what actually is happening on the ground. I think there's a really, really valuable recognition that external outputs, like external pressure, doesn't actually do much to change the internal politics of China. That if you want to see big political change in systems, in dynastic and also Leninist systems like China, that it often happens at the level of elite politics. And weirdly, in a very, very onerous, complicated bureaucratic system like the parties, that like individuals can still make a huge difference. And so what someone says in DC, or an export control or tariff that gets decided on in Washington, DC, actually doesn't have that much of an impact on what's going on in Beijing. Recognizing that we all have these different visions for what China is, cultural imaginations, political understandings, personal ties. That's what makes China so endlessly fascinating. And I didn't get into all of that in the book, but I hope through these, it's about 14 people, their stories, that you get a sense that China can be many things all at once.
Yeah, I think that's a point that Mads and I try to get us across as much as we can, that China are all these narratives happening at the same time. You have this super highly developed technology, and then you have Temu at the same time that are cheaply produced crap. And people can't quite, I think in the West at least, we can't quite grasp all these different nuances. We need to compartmentalize them. It needs to be black and white. China's this monolithic communist state, and all the Chinese are basically zombies that just obeys the party. And I mean, the truth couldn't be further from those misconceptions about China. So I also want to ask you, also being both in Taipei, of course, but now also back in DC, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you hear people have about China today? Or where do you see people get China wrong?
From an analytical framework, I think what we just talked about earlier, having a preconceived idea of what China is, usually colors analysis that follows. I think also the most basic point in this book is that China is not a monolith. I'm quoting myself now from the book, that people are not all the same, that policies are not all the same. In fact, it's the equivalent of many, many, many different countries in one federation. It's kind of like the European Union. And also another big misconception, I think, is that because when you're outside of China, what you do have access to are policy documents and announcements about things that are happening. Things are not implemented uniformly in China, as you know. So something that works in one place might not work in another, or might be implemented to the letter of the law in one place and completely ignored in another. And you only really know that if you're on the ground.
So, Emily, do you have any more books planned in the future?
I do, actually. I have a very, very short book that I'm finishing right now, and it happened really serendipitously. Again, you need to go to a place to learn things. Over the last year, just out of accident because of the news, I've been in the Middle East a lot. And I was very lucky to be in Lebanon 2 days before the Assad regime fell in Syria. So then I ended up spending a lot of time in Syria just because I was a 90-minute drive away. And one of the stories that I'd always been fascinated by and horrified by in China, and have covered consistently, is Xinjiang. Ethnic policies there, ethnic tension, the history of that region vis-a-vis Chinese empire, and the geopolitical fallout as China has detained at least hundreds of thousands of people there over the last couple of years in the latest round of this securitization push. Well, it turns out that there are a lot of Uyghurs in Syria. And I'd heard about this because they put out their own materials. China has infrequently cited their presence as a reason for why they need to arrest a lot of people in China. It's not a justification, but this is what they've said. And when in Syria, I discovered, yes, indeed, actually, there are a lot of Uyghurs. Their stories, of course, are more complicated than you would imagine, than what the Chinese government has put out. But what really, really surprised me is how much of a role the Uyghurs had in the Syrian civil war, and the disproportionate influence that they have on current internal dynamics in Syria. So I'm finishing up a project on that.
Any idea when it's going to be available? Also to our listeners, if they want to look at more.
Autumn of next year.
Kasper and I, we often discuss how much of the conversation about China focuses on the big cities, Beijing and Shanghai. And Emily, you mentioned that it was difficult during COVID to get access to the villages, but still many of the people that you touch upon and that you interview in your book, it is still people who live outside of the big cities. And you deliberately kind of draw attention to voices from outside of really the places where foreigners usually live. And I want to ask why you thought that was important, and also ask, why is it important also for people to go outside the big cities when we talk about, getting to know China better?
Because China is big. Yes, it's overwhelmingly urban these days, but a lot of people live outside the cities. A lot of culture comes from, what makes Chinese people tick and why they think the way they think comes from rural areas where if you're above the age of 40, that's where you were born and raised still in China. Just like New York and DC are not representative of the US, the big cities in China are not representative of China. That's not to say they're not important. It's meaningful to spend time there and know how those cities work, because they do represent demographically and economically so much of the country, but then you're missing 40% of the country, and that's a significant minority.
Yeah, I've also traveled a lot out in the countryside, so I can only encourage all of our listeners, bicycle if you can, go out into the countryside.
I wasn't as hardcore as you. I didn't bicycle, but that is one way to do it. I was always jealous of your adventures.
Yeah, motorbikes, bicycle, and doing the good old hitchhiking, or as Peter Hessler calls it in his book, petting the invisible dog. I believe that's what he said. Standing by the side of the road. That's what he said was the hitchhiking sign in some of the villages that he was traveling in country driving. I believe that book was called. Otherwise, Emily, we just want to say thank you for a fantastic talk here with you today, and we're really, really happy that we could have you on our podcast. And before we let you go, I would just also like to ask if you have something that you'd like to tell our listeners about, China, about journalism, or anything else, just something that you want to give out to a predominantly Danish audience.
There is less and less of good China journalism, and it's not because there aren't good China journalists out there, but there are fewer outlets who want to support that, and also less editorial interest, even among outlets that do have the resources to think about Asia, not just China. Part of that is because I think the news is not as incremental as what's happening, say, in Western Europe or the US, where there's breaking news every single day, and it's very easy to write a headline around it. The changes that are happening in China, for example, they're longue durée, they're over the medium or long term. So at what point do you say, all right, this is the moment that we say a change has happened and it's important? It's hard to make that judgment call. And it's also hard to convince an editor that it's worth that space and those resources, but it doesn't make it any less important. And to spot those trends, to follow things long-term, to be prepared for when a big story does break on Asia, you need to have people who are covering that or living there long-term. And we don't have that as much in Danish or American media.
Yeah, sadly so. That's also the reason why I'm sitting here in Copenhagen and not in Beijing, where I was living just 6 months ago. It is quite sad. But Emily, thank you so much for being our guest here in the podcast. And your book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, I think we'll provide a link to where you can buy it in Denmark. And again, we don't get affiliated money for the sales from the bookstore, but it is important if you want to get some other really important perspectives on China and getting to understand what China is today. So thank you so much, Emily. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Og til alle jer lyttere, Mads og jeg, vi er selvfølgelig snart tilbage igen med mere Kina-nørderne og flere specials. Tusind tak, fordi I lyttede med.